Welcome everybody today to our 12th in our series of webinars for Team Primary Care. I'd like to start off with our Team Primary Care led acknowledgement. So while we meet virtually, let us begin by acknowledging the ancestral territory of all the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast to coast, upon which we meet today. We acknowledge the need to work collectively and individually to recognize the past and continued effects of colonialism and racism on Indigenous families, communities, and knowledge systems through the Indian Act, Indian residential schools, Indian hospitals, and other systematically discriminating policies, practices, and documentation. We affirm our responsibility as settlers to improve relationships between nations and actively seek greater understanding of Indigenous peoples, their cultures, and in communities in which we live, learn, work, and play. Please join us in acknowledgement and commitment, each in our own way and through Team Primary Care, to move towards truth and reconciliation. I also wanted to point out to you that this is our 12th in our series of Team Primary Care webinars to date, and this is the list of the webinars that we've held since March of this year. I encourage any of you who have not seen any of these fabulous webinars to go online to the Team Primary Care website, and you will find them all there. So our next presenter is Danny Nashman. And I'm trying to figure out how to stop share here. Have I stopped sharing? I have.
Yes, you have.
Okay, thank you. Danny is presenting today on supporting change using generative approaches. Danny is a founder of the Potential group and has 30 years experience as a consultant and a certified coach in strategy and change leadership. He is a leader in the field of generative change leadership and is a guest lecturer at the Center for Faculty Development at University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, as well as teaching the Potential Group's leading strategic change and innovation coaching program. With the Potential Group, Danny has worked with hospitals, health networks, universities, NGOs, social service agencies, government agencies, and international development agencies. He has played a leading role in developing strategic change and innovation in health systems and other social enterprises. His work focuses on providing frameworks, tools, and guidance to help create strategy and bring change to life. He is a skilled designer and facilitator of interactions and initiatives that result in increased alignment, direction, and focus. In addition to his professional work, Danny is heavily involved in volunteer work, including fundraising for the Toronto People with AIDS Foundation and a
Del, you went on to mute.
Mute.
Sorry. Danny, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dale. And good morning, afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm having the privilege of supporting many different aspects of this work related to Team Primary Care, and I'm very excited to be here to have this conversation with you about leading change using generative approaches. Today, what the plan, or what I hope to do today, is to help you build on the vision of Team Primary Care. And so I just want to remind you, because this actually will be at the center of our conversation today, that the vision for Team Primary Care is very much creating an integrated health system in which every individual receives equitable, high-quality, comprehensive care from a well-trained, well-supported, and optimally utilized primary care team. And the mission, our mission together here, is to transform primary care training and education, equipping Canada's workforce for effective team-based care. So the question is, how do we move this forward? How do we do this work in a way that actually achieves the results of this mission and vision? And so what we want to talk about today is what's needed from leaders to make this happen. And today we'll explore a model of generative leadership sort of a bit of a 4-point plan about how you might move this forward. And ideally, we want to develop your capacity to have conversations that create momentum. And so we'll talk a bit about what it takes to create momentum and the kinds of conversation that stimulate momentum to desired outcomes. I will just say out loud, I know many of you are sort of listening passively to this webinar. I am going to be asking for a bit of participation. So if you wouldn't mind indulging me by answering questions as they come up, you can answer them in the chat or even possibly out loud. But I just give you a forewarning there that I am hoping to get you involved in the conversation here today. So the one thing just to say out loud is there's a whole lot to say about the evolution of change theory, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I will just say that this is not about change management. This is about leading change. And so change management, in my mind, has a lot more to do with project management in terms of, making sure that we have all the features in place and making sure we're communicating and making sure that things are laid out and paced in an appropriate way. That's not what this is about. This is about how do you lead change in a way that captures the imagination of the people you're working with, that captures their heart and mind, and creates momentum. That's what my work is mostly interested in, and how do we create momentum in systems towards change? And so in that regard, what we've come to understand that leaders in complex adaptive systems, like the ones we work in, have to be able to engage and enable others to shape direction with them. This is not something that can be managed from the center because of the complexity of the work, particularly that we're doing in team primary care, trying to enable massive changes in the system. We can't actually direct that from the center. We need to engage others to help shape the direction with us. We have to be able to empower other people to move toward that vision in the way that works for them, so that we're not pushing one agenda. We're actually giving people a light to move towards, and having them, move in their own way towards that light. We need leaders who can plant seeds for change in conversation. So always sort of thinking about, how do I advance thinking around this in this conversation or that conversation? And lastly, we have to be able to adapt. And certainly many of you have probably experienced, even during the course of this project, the amount of adaptation needed as you start to learn new things, as you realize where there's appetite for change, where there's not appetite for change, and as new knowledge and new possibilities emerge. And so that's what we're going to be building skill with today on all of these levels. So I'm going to ask, this is my first opportunity for participation. What are you learning about what it takes to successfully lead change in your institutions and teams and in your projects? What are you learning about what it takes to do that? I'm going to ask you to post something in the chat just to say, what kinds of things are you learning about leading change in the world right now? If a couple of people just can give us a couple of thoughts here. What we often hear, passion, and willing partners. So it takes passion and willing partners. It's hard, yes. Communication to stakeholders, early and ongoing. We have to continue to do that. It takes patience and determination. You need to be role model, a strong and positive vision, values. You need buy-in, lovely. You need organization. There's a lot of influences to consider. It's not just, you can't just lead it in one way. There's a lot of other pieces like political and resources and so on. Clear communication, a willingness to change and engagement from staff. It's important to value the intent of the change. Thanks, Barbara. That's really an important feature, is saying, if the purpose of the change isn't foregrounded, it often gets lost in the shuffle, and we'll talk a bit more about that today, that everyone is at a different stage in transforming healthcare and engaging the members to see where they're at. So again, we want to understand where people are at, and we're not all in the same place. It's difficult to get buy-in with an exhausted workforce. You are right on the money there. So many meetings we go to, it often starts with people's sense of burnout and overwhelm. Learning from and moving beyond failures, built into destination, buy into the destination, absolutely that purpose once again. Keeping learning and current of the fast changing environment, commitment, having to provide a value proposition, brilliant. So again, you know a lot about this already. This is not new information for you in some ways, but I do want to just point to some of the things that you have said in there. Again, this is hard. There is complexity. It does take a lot of stalwartness to move forward, particularly in the current environment, but keeping that purpose at the center is going to be a key feature here. So we're going to talk about 4 things today about practices for generative change leadership. The first is about generativity, which we'll talk in a minute. It's really about this focus on where you want to go. not at the barriers, not what's in our way, but where do you want to go? The second is what you've already highlighted here already, is foregrounding purpose. To say, how do you frame everything you're doing with purpose in mind so that people aren't wondering, why are we doing this thing? Why is this important? You're actually putting that out in front of people. The third principle is to go where the energy is and to follow it. So you want to look at, where are there sparks? Where are there moving trains that you can latch onto? Where are there opportunities to move things forward without trying to push too much in that? And then lastly, we'll talk about questions, and we'll talk about a thing called generative questions, which help move things forward and create and almost till the soil for momentum. Okay, so we'll do each one by one. The first, generativity. So generativity, when you take a generative approach, it means you identify and focus on the thing that's going to move you forward. So this is a continual commitment to say, how do we move towards what we want, as opposed to spending a lot of time dwelling on what's in our way or root causes or barriers. We spend time saying, how do we get there, as opposed to what's in our way? And I know it sounds like semantics, but it makes a significant difference in terms of the conversation and the sentiment in a room or conversation or meeting, whatever it is. If you're focused on how do we get to the future as opposed to what's in our way, it changes things dramatically. People do have the ability to identify barriers. If I went into any room that you're in and I put up a flip chart and says, what's in our way around primary care? We could make lists for days, flip charts. We can make 10, 15 flip charts continually. People might even enjoy and find it cathartic to say, wow, this is all in our way. But I would argue it doesn't actually move us forward. And so when you take a generative approach, you are constantly thinking about how to move forward. Now, generativity at a foundation is based upon a principle called appreciative inquiry. So it's the other AI that is sometimes referred to in the world. And this is fundamentally a strength-based approach to change that ultimately, at the center of it, it's about the fact that we move and evolve in the way we inquire, in the way we think. So if we inquire into what's in our way and what the problems are in our world, we actually elevate that in our minds. And in doing so, it creates a deeper sense of problem. But if we appreciate what we're doing, if we actually can spend time looking at our strengths and elevate what's our best and think about what do we want to co-create, we actually can move more energy towards creating that outcome that we're leaning towards. And so fundamentally, what it looks like in practice is it's different than our traditional way of looking at leading change. Sometimes we lead change, or we're taught to lead change. Certainly in schooling, we're taught this way, is we lead change by solving a problem. And so when we do that, our job is to really get clear on what's the problem. Like, if you don't understand the problem, there's no way we can look for solutions. Okay, that's one way to think of it. So what we do is we analyze the problem, look at the causes, and then say, okay, how do we solve that problem? And ultimately, we create goals and strategies to fix the problems. Let me say there's nothing wrong with this approach, but the ultimate outcome you will get in this case is that your problems are solved. And sometimes that's enough. There's many settings in which that's enough. In settings of transformational change, what I find is that's not enough, because ultimately, just because the problem is solved doesn't mean we're getting actually what we want. So another way, based in an appreciative approach or based in a generative approach, is about creating change based upon moving toward a desired outcome. And in this case, there's value in understanding, what are we already doing in alignment with that outcome? I don't know if you ever walked in a room and tried to introduce a new thing and notice that people push back in the moment. So imagine going in and saying, okay, we need to have a team building retreat. Imagine saying that to your group. What do you think you imply when you say we need a team building retreat? Maybe we're not a great team. Maybe there's a problem. People start to speculate what's going on around us. So sometimes starting with strength creates a much better platform upon which for people to move forward, because they feel disarmed. They feel like, oh, we're actually moving in this direction. And then the next phase is to envision desired outcomes, what could be, designing strategies about how we build that to life or how we make that happen. And then you implement, learn, and adapt. So in this case, you almost broaden the pie. You broaden the context of the conversation into hopes about what we want to create versus just solving the problems in front of us. So again, this generative approach gives you a possibility of looking at more than just what's in front of you. And so what it means is that when we're leading change with a generative lens, we're going to ask different kinds of questions. Often we're trained, and I was trained, I have an MBA, I was trained in school about the SWOT analysis is critically important. I still get asked millions of times with clients to do a SWOT analysis saying, what are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities? What are our threats? That somehow there's a belief we have to be truly balanced in order to move things forward, or we have to understand what are the barriers, or what are the risks? And people get a lot of energy in talking about these conversations. But imagine when you're taking a generative approach, what you want to look at is not what's in your way, but how do we get to what we want? So instead of saying something like, why is this not working? We might say something like, what would we like to see happening here? And how can we make that happen? And again, instead of that sort of SWOT, strength, weakness thing, we might say, what do we want to build on or have more of? What is it that we can create more of in our system here? So notice in asking that question, I will get at the strength, I will get at the weakness, but I don't have to dwell in the problem. I can actually shift to solutions or shift to what we want to create here. And again, what are the barriers? Can shift to what would it take to get here? Again, we're still talking about barriers, but we're talking about it with a generative frame. So just curious, just from hearing this on first blush, I know this is just a first little bit of generativity here. What are you starting to notice about where you might be able to apply generativity in your work? Where might you be able to infuse this in your work? Where might this add value? What's starting to tickle your imagination already about this? I'll ask you to post just a couple things in the chat. Where could this be helpful? Where could these kinds of questions actually add a bit of value in your worlds today? Yeah. So very messy, sticky, complex issues. Yeah. When it's really messy, sometimes our instinct is to go to what's messy about it, rather than saying, how do we get out of it? Yeah. So again, it's a more positive way to build momentum, engaging others, absolutely. And pretty much on any project, absolutely. So engaging and planning, yeah, there's many spaces in which we could engage more generativity in our work. So let's move to the second item here, and giving hope for future direction. I think that's great, and that's particularly in topics. Let me just say quickly, in typically difficult topics or difficult times, finding a place where you can re-engage people's optimism is so powerful. In my experience, when there is no optimism, people tend not to want to move or participate. And so our job sometimes as leaders is to open up space for optimism, not false optimism, not sunny optimism, not fake optimism, but true optimism for, you know what, how could we move forward, even in the most difficult situations? I believe there's a path forward. Okay, let's look at the second piece. So not surprising, you might imagine that in order to have a generative frame, you probably have to know what you're generating. What are you trying to move towards? And so it's really important that we foreground purpose and be able to talk about where you're going in ways that really honor the intentions of the work that you're going to. So even the small pieces of the project, the small pieces of your work, it's useful to remind people of purpose. So this is designed to do something. So just think about for a minute how you currently describe the purpose of your project and how others describe it. Just take a minute, reflect for a second. How do you talk about your project? What comes up in most meetings? What comes up in most topics when you're talking about your project? And what do you notice about how others describe it? So what I notice in this space when I talk to people, people are talking about their projects, they say great things about their project. It's super exciting. We're developing a new curriculum. We're teaching interprofessional competencies. Lovely. We're promoting team-based care. We're creating a new case study or new approaches. We're integrating new health professionals in our environment. All of these things are beautiful things that you're doing. But I would argue that they're missing something. They're missing the why part. What's the purpose? What is this new curriculum for? So sometimes when we walk into a room and we say, we're developing a new curriculum, people might wonder, why are we doing this, first of all? And second of all, without purpose, people don't know how to relate to it. And often they might even push back on some of these things because they're not clear on purpose. That is why things like a vision and mission that you have in team primary care are really helpful. So when you're trying to amplify purpose, you're talking about your work in the context of what matters most about this work for the people it's designed to serve, what benefit might this work generate and for whom? What difference will it make? And again, anchored in vision and mission. So in our case, everything you're doing probably is in some ways supporting more optimally utilized primary care teams. It's supporting potentially training and education that equips Canada's workforce for effective team-based care. It goes beyond just curriculum. It goes beyond just training people. It's for the purpose of making a difference for Canadians, for an integrated health system that is bigger than any small piece of a curriculum. And so there's value in amplifying that and pulling that forward. So again, if all you say is, I'm designing a new curriculum, it's a disservice to what you're doing. Maybe your purpose is to ensure that learners have the confidence to practice comprehensive primary care as part of teams that enable every Canadian to receive equitable, high-quality, comprehensive care from a well-trained, well-supported, and optimally utilized primary care team. Now, that's a mouthful. You don't need to say that full mouthful, but you'll notice you can amplify any part of that sentence. But if all you're saying, if you're going to a meeting and the meeting is called Designing a New Curriculum meeting, you are missing something that's going to breathe life into your work. Again, training on IPC. So many of these things are like, of course, oh, it's a great purpose. Yeah, it's IPC, yay, or IPE, it's so great. If you don't anchor it to why, it's just not going to yield it may not yield the full results that you want. So in this case, maybe it's about ensuring that learners can work effectively and efficiently as part of teams so they can better meet diverse needs, they can address gaps in care. Again, this is all a mouthful, but how do you talk about your work in a way that truly honors its purpose and its potential value? So let's think through how you do your purpose. So just curious right now, where do you see opportunities to foreground purpose in the work you're doing? What parts of your work right now that maybe you're not foregrounding it in the way you could? So we made deliberate steps to talk about why it matters and to learn from those we expect to engage in the change and why it matters for them. In the past, we were process-focused, describing the change, the work. Brilliant. So Barbara, it sounds like you made the shift already to move into an environment where we're truly thinking about purpose at the front of this. And that's really, really powerful. Keep in mind, this extends in any work that you do, any meeting that you have, any interaction that you are engaged with. When you have purpose foregrounded, it actually shifts the interaction in the conversation and has a higher degree of momentum in what you do. Okay, let us move to the third piece. Is good. And I see Sally starting a primary care team network, so it's very important. It's really, really important. I'll tell you, it's most important in particular when it sounds like what you're doing is obviously important and people will get it. That's the time you need to say it out loud. That's the time you actually need to articulate it, because sometimes when we say things like we should collaborate better, everyone would agree, of course we should. But when we haven't said the why, it's just missing that nuance that's going to give it more momentum and more oomph or more power. Okay, the third piece, going with the energy. So I love this image here. If you've ever been in the campfire making business, that we are all, in order to make fire, you need to fan the fire. And so what we do is, how do you amplify what's moving already in our system? So what's already happening in alignment with the goal is a great question to be asking. How do we have more of what we do? What can we learn from what is moving? That is where we create momentum in our systems. And that's where sometimes we find leaders fall down, is we don't build on energy and we assume that there isn't actually movement. I will just say, even in systems that feel completely stuck, there is probably 1%, half of 1%, 0.1% where there is momentum. It is useful to fan that flame. No matter how small, it can build into a fire over time. So your principle here is to go with the energy. Follow where people have energy in your work. Try not to push too hard where people don't have energy. And try not to be too attached to exactly how it's going to go. One of the principles that we talk about in our work is a many boats, one light concept. So as long as people are moving towards the light in our organizations and system, they can take their boat at the speed that works for them, at the pace that works for them, and in the manner that works for them, as long as they're moving in that direction. We will create more momentum on building on where people have energy. So what about resistance? What about resistance? how many people, if you can actually use your reaction buttons on the screen here, how many people have encountered any resistance in their project so far? Raise your hand or give me a reaction button. There we go. We have a little bit of reactions. We have some thumbs up. Yes, we have. And we're laughing about that. Yes, because resistance happens all the time. We see it all the time. I've said this before, those of you who've seen me speak about this before, I'll say one thing. I actually don't encounter resistance. And not because I'm ignoring it, I don't think. It doesn't occur to me that people are resisting when they resist. Because why do people resist? Why do people dig in their heels on things? So people recognize the need for change, but they don't have time. Great, yeah. Why? People resist fear, possibly, the unknown, all these things about why people resist. The thing is, change fatigue. Brilliant. They don't understand why it needs to change. Yeah, there's so many reasons why people resist. So the question is, and loss. Yeah, often we have a sense of loss, or we have that almost a grief theory about change, which has people like they need to move through the process of that in change. I think that's true for some and not true for others. And no one took time to talk to them. Yeah, absolutely. So there's many people why they resist. How many of you have ever resisted anything in your life? Anyone? Anyone? Are we terrible people? Are you a terrible person for resisting? Are you one of these people who have fear of change and all those sorts of things? We all resist things sometimes. And why? Because we think we have a good reason. And yet sometimes as leaders, if we frame the people around us as resistors, we're almost devaluing what they're bringing. We're almost implying that, oh, well, if they really knew this was good, they would change. Here's the thing. What they're standing for is probably important to them. And if we ignore that, if we don't go with that energy, we're missing something. So when you see resistance, a couple things to think about. First of all, check your own reaction. So sometimes if we're in the front of a room and people raise their hand and say, wait a second, that's not right, I can be sure that 95% of us will get triggered by that. Oh my gosh, what have I said? Have I not done this right? Well, whew. So you need to breathe for a minute. And maybe it's time to shift your perspective to say, I wonder what's important to this person. I wonder why it is that they're saying this. I wonder what wisdom that they might be bringing to this conversation that I could understand. Or I wonder if there's an opportunity for learning for me or for them that we could actually look there. So the trick here is to resist defending or explaining or retelling them the why at this point. When you hear resistance, your job is to find out what's going on for them. And when you do, you will start to notice what they have passion for, what they have energy for, what they're committed to. Many people when resistant are actually safeguarding things. They're trying to protect themselves or your colleagues, particularly when people talk about our overwhelm and burnout, right? People are actually saying, you know what? This is so much. I'm worried for myself and my colleagues. I'm worried for the quality of care I can provide. I'm worried for the quality of teaching I could do. That's a really lovely worry that you care that much. And so think about what are they trying to advocate for? What do they care deeply about? Find out what is there. Find out what's underneath it. When you do, you will notice that energy of resistance will dissipate and you'll start to step to their side for a minute and say, how do we work together to move forward in a way that aligns with energy? So your job is to find their energy, go with it. Their boat might take a circuitous route. They might stop at an island along the way, and that's okay, as long as they're moving in the direction towards what's most important to both you and them. Final element that I will share with you today is that questions are more important than answers. So you've almost heard me imply this earlier, is that telling people in the context of change is far less powerful than asking them. So when you're leading change, generative questions are your friend. They point people towards what you're trying to generate, and that's really what you want to engage people in as much as possible. The reason they're so powerful is they cause people to delve into their own minds about whatever topic you've given them and find space for that topic. So if I ask people to say, where might there be some benefit in engaging in this new curriculum for both our students and the practice environments in which they work. Even if they don't believe there's any benefit, by asking that question, I've opened their mind to the possibility there might be, and I will cause them to think in that direction as much as possible. Even if only 1% of their brain is thinking that, I will extend that 1% and amplify, again, fan that 1% as much as possible to try and build more context for their understanding. Even if you've asked a generative question, people may answer whatever they want to answer, and that's okay too. But by asking a question that points people in a certain direction, I have the greater possibility that I'm going to expand conversation in the direction of what I've asked about. So just be aware, as a leader, you are always fanning something. How you talk, what you ask, what you engage with creates more of that. If you walk into the room and say, well, this is really going to be difficult. It's going to be a really tough conversation today. I'm really worried it's going to go really poorly. Okay, let's start the meeting. What do you imagine you've just planted in the room? You planted the notion this is going to be difficult. Now, there's times it is generative and helpful to create safe spaces in which to have conversations. Safety is critically important for conversations, but just be conscious of what you're fanning as a leader. How can you talk about creating safety, as an example, in a way that fans the light of creating conversations that create better outcomes for us, for others, for our systems, for our communities, that create safer spaces for us and our colleagues, all of that. That is what you could fan as a leader. So how do you craft generative questions or generative questions? So the first thing is you have to be clear about what you're trying to generate. So if you're trying to generate more confidence in the room, you might ask a simple question like, what are you feeling a bit more confident about? Or what would it take to have you feel more confident in what we're doing? Very often what we do is when we're working with people and we're trying to find out, we're trying to get alignment around the next step, we might ask a question is, what would have you feel confident about the next step here today? Not only does it have them feel a bit more confident after having asked that question, but it gives us hints about what we need to do to help support them to feel confident, which is super helpful. So try and be really clear. What is the thing? What's the purpose you want to amplify here? So the purpose might be about creating more energy for team-based care, team-based learning, interprofessional learning. It might be about trying to create a greater sense of openness for something. It might be trying to create a greater sense of comfort with what's going on. Whatever it is, ask about that. And think about, what do you want people to think and feel? So if there were thought bubbles on people's heads leaving a room, think about, what do you want them thinking and feeling? And then you ask your question in that direction, something that's most in service of the purpose that we've been talking about here today. So something to consider, generative questions sometimes are a bit too sunny for people. So we've taught this before, and we've had one of our students come back to us with a complaint, and they said, well, I learned these generative questions. So, I work in the emergency room. So I decided I was going to take some generative questions to the patients who are waiting in the emergency room. And so I went in, I did what you said. You said, ask questions, about their experience. So I said, what are you valuing most about your experience here in the emergency room today? What's really working about your waiting today? And they looked at me like I was crazy. Here's the thing. You gotta read the room here, people. You have to be aware of the room you're in, who you're speaking to, what's important to them, and pace your questions accordingly. So in some cases, if you're walking into a room and you want people to feel a sense of progress, you might ask, what are you feeling really proud of about what we've done here today? There's probably many of you in your projects, it would be totally appropriate to walk into your project team and saying, what are you really proud of so far? Great question, brilliant. But if you have a group that's feeling down or feeling that they haven't made progress, can you imagine what that feels like to them? It feels like you totally have missed the boat and you have no idea what they're feeling. So sometimes you have to be a little less about your questions. You might have to say something like, what glimmers of movement have you noticed? Or what tiny things are starting to take a tiny bit of hold? Even when there's zero progress, it is useful to ask people, what glimmers of movement have you seen? It is shocking what people say that is unknown to you that they see as progress. So let them tell you what there is. Again, be really careful about getting too sunny in your questions or too sunny in what you're doing here. You want to focus on things that are truly generative, meaning they're moving towards something, they create momentum, but they're not pushing people well beyond where they are at. So pay attention to the energy in your group. There's also cultures in the world that are more or less open to sunny language. So be aware, there's some professions that are not really open to sunny language. I will just say out loud that if I walk into a group of researchers, my general sense is I don't go too sunny. I have the same approach with physicians. I know there's some physicians here and researchers here too. I just don't go in too sunny. Why? It doesn't work. People look at me like I'm crazy. And so I really have to be careful, but I do not shy away from asking generative questions because I know there's value to them. It's a gift to have people to have a conversation about progress, but I have to do it in a way that actually is useful. And again, progress is just one example. There's many ways to do this. So other generative questions that you might be able to use, if you want to actually think about, how might this idea make our work even better? What do you imagine people would think after you had that conversation? This idea might make our work better. What would it take to make this work? Is a great one about, how do we move forward even when it's difficult? You might ask something a bit more bold, like imagine we implemented this in a way that worked. What would be different? What would be possible? It's not possible now. So again, there you're looking at almost a visionary question. What could we achieve here if we worked on this and we got to a really great outcome? You could ask things about, where are we closest to what you'd like to see here? Where are some glimmers? Back to that glimmer times type question. And again, I like conversations with groups that are overwhelmed. It's lovely to say, what small change could we make? Could we work on? What little thing could we work on this week, this month, this year that would make the most difference? What's strange when you ask that kind of questions, and I've had groups that walk in overwhelmed, once people have the space to be creative and they don't feel like they're pushed, they make lists that are far too long for their appetite. Like sometimes they actually just become really excited about this and they actually step in and there's more things that they even want to do than you even thought possible. So one of the things that's really powerful about generative questions is that things show up sometimes that you hadn't even thought about because you've given space for people to talk in this way. So last thing I'll share in terms of generative questions is that sometimes in every interaction, there's great space to do some generative thinking. Sometimes at the opening of a meeting, creating space that sets the tone for the meeting is a really powerful thing to do. So one thing you could ask, what would have you walking away feeling more confident today? Is a great question. And what do you imagine that would be generating? If you ask, what would have you walking away feeling more confident? You're going to generate a feeling of more confidence. That is correct. What's one thing you're looking forward to about this meeting? Again, I'm going to create positive anticipation. Around ideas, you could say, how could this idea help us to do the thing that we already care about? So in this case, how would this idea help us to create an even more powerful curriculum or an even more powerful experience to support interprofessional care? Around even when you're exploring concerns, you can do them in a generative way. Doesn't mean you step over concerns. You do want to talk about there. But again, you might ask something like, what would make it seem easier? Or what do you need to support you right now is a great generative question, because it's not asking what's wrong. It's asking, what do you need? And that's more instructive to move us forward. And the last thing, ending a meeting. It's very helpful to ask a generative question at the meeting. And so I'm going to ask you, how many people at the end of their meetings say something like, what do you think? Does that make sense? Or are there any questions? We all do. In fact, if I wasn't thinking or wasn't paying attention, I would do the same at the end of this conversation, and you'll notice I won't. Why? Because it is a throwaway question. At the end of your conversation, do you want people to tell you if it made sense or not? Is that really what you want people to think about? Do you want people to say just any questions? Or is there a more specific question that you're really more curious about? Is there some way you'd like people to be thinking at the end of this meeting? If there is, ask about it. So maybe it's, what did you value most about our time together? Or what was most useful about this? And I will say, I've had many meetings that have gone, actually, I should not say I've had many meetings. I've had a few meetings which have gone very poorly. in the middle of them. And in those meetings, what I notice is I tend to be shy about asking a question at the end, something like, what did you value most about our time together? I had one situation when I was presenting a strategy we were working on for years to a board of directors. And when we walked into that board of directors meeting, I felt pretty good about it. But during the meeting, I shared the strategy and people started going crazy. Well, this isn't a strategy. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. What do you mean? We can't use this. People went on and I just stood there at the front of the room thinking, oh my gosh, this is going so poorly. I got to get out of here as soon as I can. And so after about 45 minutes of complete vomit in the room about this strategy, I took a breath and I said, you know what? I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to attempt to say, okay, let's see. I'm going to assume they valued something about this. And I asked them, what did you value about our time together? And hands flew in the air. This was the most honest we've been in years. We work together as a board. We are really standing up for our organization. This is the most assertive and powerful we've been as a board. They had the best meeting they've ever had. And I was about to cry at the front of the room. But it's not about me. My job is to make sure they've had an experience. They had an experience. I left the room. I grabbed some Kleenex because I needed some, because I needed to have a cry at the end of that one. But I was shocked at the end of the meeting. So there is tremendous value that even if things haven't gone well in your meeting, you can color the end of the experience with something that reshapes it into having them say, what's useful about this? We just spent an hour together. What was useful about it for you? And inevitably, surprisingly, people do come up with something that's powerful. People do come up with something, and that's the best surprise there is there. Yeah, thank you. So I want to reiterate something here right now. This is not about being positive. This is not about being positive. This is about actively, continuously pointing to where you want to go and moving all of the conversation in that direction. That is your job. Point, point, point with your questions. Point towards the purpose. Point toward the outcome that you want, because that is what will move you and the organization forward. So the 4 practices we talked about here today is look at where you want to go, not the barriers. Foreground purpose, again, making sure that it's clear for people, not just at the beginning, but during every element that you do. Foreground purpose. Use generative questions that are shaped around purpose. Start and continue to go where energy is. Identify and fan the sparks. Let people take their boat towards that light in ways that work for them. Don't push too hard on the boulders. And seek to understand when you do encounter what feels like resistance. Honor the fact that people are probably coming from a good place and try and understand what that resistance is about. And finally, use questions as opposed to telling. Telling people at the end of that meeting with the board meeting, if I asserted to the group, well, it seems like you really came together as a board today. What do you imagine they would have said to me? No, we didn't. It's not for me to tell. It's for me to ask. And that's really, as a change leader, your job is fundamentally to ask and shape questions that move people towards the outcomes that are important to them. So I'm going to ask you just to pause for a moment and just think, how could you see yourself using these practices as you lead change in your roles? And I'm going to open the floor to also some questions you have about using this. So you can post either how you could see yourself using this or a question about how you could see or how you might want to use this going forward. So Kim, I hope we can get this recorded because I'm going to want to play it on repeat. Yes. Well, it is something that takes some time to do. I will just say out loud that crafting generative questions takes time and takes practice. It takes a lot of practice there. That when you ask questions, our natural way of asking questions isn't this way. Yeah, again, feel free to share this with others. That is lovely. So what questions do come up for you about how you use this?
Danny,
Ivy has her hand up.
Just want to acknowledge, yeah, I just want to acknowledge, Danny, and just recognize for the group that, I first met you over 20 years ago, and was so inspired by how you were thinking and how you were utilizing this methodology. And it always surprises me, even today, when people say, "Hey, have you heard about that appreciative inquiry, like generative questioning? Oh, this is so amazing." I'm like, yeah, that's just amazing. And I always go back to the fact that that it's been here for years, and you have been a leader in that. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you for that, and thank you for being a part of Team Primary Care.
Bobby, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, and it is something that strangely doesn't even get tired for me, and I've been doing this for years. It is something because it's like particularly in those more difficult scenarios when you are walking into a room and there's multiple perspectives, and considering in what's in our world now for me, thinking about, how do we bridge fundamental gaps in the world? Generative questions are the way to go, but pacing is the question. It's how do we pace with people so that people can walk into rooms, have dialogue with each other, and see hope and see optimism for the future. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts, or just comments about how could you see yourself using these when you lead change in your role? You can raise your hand and say it out loud too. I'm gonna stop my share for a second so I can see. So, Lynn, would appreciate hearing what to do when you first what you do when you first do generative question leads to barriers, challenges, answering it off the mark. Yeah. So even if you said, so what would it take to make this work? Let's say you've asked that question and people say, nothing, this will never work. That's when you leave the room and you tuck your tail between your legs and you say, you know what? That was a great meeting, but I'm out of here. No. So there is an opportunity to follow up with that. We don't want to step over, and I want to be really clear here. We're not stepping over people who need to say what the barrier is, because sometimes people do need to say that, and that gets back to the whole question of resistance. So where is their energy? So if someone says, "I can't see," I don't know how this is going to work. I would honor it. It sounds like you're not really clear on how this would work. What do you think? Even a tiny thing in it, like I would actually go to. What are you already doing that's aligned with this? Is probably where I'd go, because when people say nothing will work, never, like any of the nothings, nevers are always suspicious for me. And they always tell me, can't believe that's actually true. So I would say, I imagine you're doing some of this already. Where is that in that? Or I imagine there's parts of this you've tried in the past. What have you already tried? Like just trying to find a way to go with their energy without delving into, well, tell me more about the barriers. I want to find out something that gives a little bit of traction in the conversation. But people, I will tell you, as you've experienced probably, Lynn, as well, because you know these questions. People do go to what's in our way, what's not there. The other question you could ask is, what would it take to overcome that? What do you know about overcoming that kind of a barrier? What have you learned about that kind of barrier? Also, learning is a great question, particularly when things are stuck, to say, what kinds of learning have you had about this? And I bet you they have learning about this. No one has stopped in their tracks. People are still moving. People are still going to work. People are still providing care. People are still teaching. So to find out from them, what are you learning about this, as opposed to feeling like you have to be on the spot to solve it? Ask that. What are you learning about this? Kyle, I see you said, I would love to use this when teaching. Yes, on a boring topic, and their eyes glaze over with boredom. Yes. So I think that's exactly it, is how could you see what we're learning today adding value to your work as a clinician? And letting that sit in the room with all the bored faces. And they might say, I actually don't know. This is so boring. I don't know where it's going. Huh. Okay. Well, what elements in here might have some potential for you, I would go to. So again, it's a lovely, lovely question. It's a great teaching question. What are you learning about this? Particularly when you want them to learn about X and it's clear to you they're not getting it yet. You could actually ask them, how does this connect with your commitment to personal professionalism? How does this link to the work that you're already doing about models of care? Like, you actually can make those links for them by asking the question. I love that. Any other questions or places where you think you might want to use this?
Danny, do you have any examples to provide with an interprofessional group where you've had a group of several different types of healthcare professionals in the room?
Yeah, so that's a great. So again, in an interprofessional context, the kinds of questions you want to ask are likely about, how do we stimulate learning with, from, and about one another? And so you might ask things like, what have you learned about your colleagues in the profession through this workshop, through this simulation, through this work here? What are you starting to understand about where scopes of practice might overlap? Like, notice whatever it is I'm trying to generate, I can shape a question about it. So if I'm trying to shape people's sense of openness to introduce a new profession in the group, what have you learned about the value of working together with other professions? So if I'm working either at even those who don't work in teams can actually say, well, I have a good relationship with the pharmacist and this patient I have. This pharmacist and I, we are so in sync, and so they allow me to work really well together. So what does that tell you about possibilities of working with others? So again, I'm opening doors. The critical thing about all of this is getting crystal clear on what you're trying to generate and the purpose for your conversation. And unfortunately, I would argue we go to many meetings and conversations that have no purpose. Sorry, did I say that out loud? They are purposeless. Not that they don't have a reason to be there, but we're not infusing the conversation with purpose. And so it becomes sometimes just a why are we here conversation. So if you're going to have conversations, have them on purpose. And once you know the purpose, crafting your generative question is like 1,000,000 times easier. Because all you ask is what you're trying to generate. How could we collaborate more here? What could we learn from each other? What things could we do together that we couldn't do alone? Where could we build greater capacity for our system? What possibilities for improved access could there be? I mean, there's 1,000,000 questions. It's just, what am I trying to generate in this conversation and how do I get there? I do have one last question for the group. And that is, what was most useful about this learning for you? I'm going to ask everyone just to put one thing in the chat. What was most useful about this learning for you? Nothing. Good. Thanks, Kyle. I like that. Tell me more about nothing, though. Being intentional with people's time. Oh, if everyone could do that, could you imagine if you went to every meeting and it actually had a purpose? Whew, wouldn't that be great? How to close out a discussion with the right questions. Yeah, even that, Kim, honestly, if you just do that, you will notice a difference in how people walk out of the room and how people walk into the room next. That's kind of cool in there. A positive approach to change and motivating others. Absolutely. Reflection on your own approach, self-reflection on how to approach resistance. Brilliant. The reminder to nudge and point them towards change and growth. Yep, I love the nudging. That's exactly it. We're just nudging people in different directions. Pacing to questions when under tough times and mandates. Yeah. So being really clear that you really have to read the room and you really have to be aware of what's going on in people's lives. Not overly so, but enough that you will pace your questions accordingly. Seeing possibilities for changing the questions I ask. Brilliant. I love that. Humility and humbleness. Lovely. A reminder to always go towards the direction of purpose. Yeah. What you'll start to notice, you might start to notice after this conversation, is that you'll notice where there's no purpose. You'll go, oh my gosh, what? I don't even know why we're here. What? And so just be aware. That's okay. Take a breath and then realize next time, just think ahead in your meeting and why are we here and what questions might we want to ask here? Why did I ask this question? Why did I ask this last question here? That's right, because I wanted you to leave the room feeling this was useful. And that's why I asked that question. It's as simple as that, everyone. So thank you for your time, everyone. I hope this was useful for you. And Dale, I guess I'll pass back to you.
Thank you so much, Danny. And as I mentioned in the chat, all of the webinars are available online, and I'm going to try for a second time to share my screen. And just to remind people that these are the past webinars, and These webinars, as well as Danny's, are available on the Team Primary Care website. So please, I welcome everybody, encourage everyone to go to see each of these webinars, because it's been a fantastic set of, this is the 12th in our series. Also, I think if you've got any questions specifically, Danny may be open to them. So not putting it in place, Danny, but he's been very helpful to Team Primary Care and provided a great deal of insight, and is helping us in terms of planning our conference. So you will see some generative questions at the summit in February as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. And as you leave, there will be a survey, so please complete it, and have a wonderful Friday afternoon and weekend. Thanks to all.